Easy on me.
It happens.
All right. Verse 2.
My soul today, a carol to my King, and Jesus is meek and near, the songs I cannot sing. Sunshine, sunshine, when the peaceful, happy moments roll, when Jesus shows His smiling face, there is sunshine in my soul. There is springtime in my soul today, for when the Lord is near, the dove of peace is in my heart, the flowers of grace appear. Sunshine, blessed sunshine, when the peaceful, happy moments roll, when Jesus shows His smiling face, there is sunshine in my soul. There is sadness in my soul today, and hope and love and praise for blessings which gives me now, for joys in future days. Sunshine, blessed sunshine, when the peaceful, happy moments roll, when Jesus shows His smiling face, there is sunshine in my soul. Please be seated and turn in your Bibles to Matthew chapter 7, verses 13 through 29. Matthew chapter 7. We've been going through the Sermon on the Mount, and we have talked about ways that life should be lived. Jesus shared that we should be a light to people and an asset to their lives. We have an expanded commandment that we should love one another. We were warned about who might be stage actors. Remember that word I don't like? Hypocrites, or stage actors. I like stage actors better. And especially the stage actors in matters of prayer and giving, and those who want to be recognized for their piety. That's nobody in this congregation. The fact that we need to forgive as we want to be forgiven. And Jesus told us to strive to be without guile. We need to be sincere. We need to be genuine. And we need to be without moral darkness. That was last week. Oh, and the other one? Pray like you mean it. Remember that? Pray like you mean it. And keep on... No, you're going to say it. Keep on asking. Keep on asking. Because God did not mean for us to pray and then pretend like everything was done and we could go away and forget everything. I know that is more for us than it is for God, because God doesn't need to be reminded. We need to be reminded that God does what He says He's going to do. turn to me to Matthew. Turn with me to Matthew 7, verses 13 through 29. And if you, after we finish that, if you want to put your thumb back in 1 John chapter 4, that's someplace you might want to go later. I think I might also be looking at Jeremiah here somewhere. Enter by the narrow gate, for the gate is wide and the way is broad that leads to destruction, and many are those who enter by it. For the gate is small and the way is narrow that leads to life, and few are those who find it. Beware of the false prophets who come to you in sheep's clothing, but inwardly are ravenous wolves. You will know them by their fruits. Grapes are not gathered from thorn bushes, nor figs from thistles, are they? Even so, every good tree bears good fruit, and the bad tree bears bad fruit. A good tree cannot produce bad fruit, nor can a bad tree produce good fruit. Every tree that does not bear good fruit is cut down and thrown into the fire. So then you will know them by their fruits. Not everyone who says to me, Lord, Lord, will enter into the kingdom of heaven, but he who does the will of my Father who is in heaven. Many will say to me on that day, Lord, Lord, did we not prophesy in your name? And in your name cast out demons? And in your name perform many miracles? And then I declare to them, I never knew you. Depart from me, you who practice lawlessness. Therefore, everyone who hears these words of mine and acts upon them may be compared to a wise man who built his house upon a rock. And the rain descended, and the floods came, and the winds blew and burst into the house, and yet it did not fall, for it was founded on a rock. And everyone who hears these words of mine and does not act upon them will be like a foolish man who built his house upon the sand. And the rains descended, and the floods came, and the winds blew and burst against that house, and it fell. And great was its fall. The result was that when Jesus had finished these words, and these are talking about the words all the way back to chapter 5. The result was that when Jesus had finished these words, the multitudes were amazed at his teaching, for he was teaching them as one having authority, and not as their scribes. So here we are at the end of the sermon. At the end of the sermon? Good. Here we are at the end of the sermon, and now we have a warning and a promise. First of all, we are to enter by the narrow gate. To me, that has always been interesting, having been brought up in a very strict, narrow church. It's always been interesting, because isn't life easier when we take the broad way? I'm not talking about rush hour, but isn't it easier when you go out on 495 at 6 o'clock in the morning and you have those 8 lanes, sometimes 9 lanes, and maybe 5 or 6 cars out there? And you can act like everybody else in the counties and pretend like the speed limit is a suggestion? Isn't that easier? Because I can make it from Silver Spring to Upper Marlboro in 20 minutes. Figure that one out. 20 minutes. Silver Spring to Upper Marlboro. Yeah. Because the speeds will let you go, and you can get there quickly. But Is it easier to break the law and speed on 495? The suggestion speed, I think it's still 55. They haven't moved it up. They keep talking about moving it up to 65. Because nobody drives 55 anyway. Committing is much harder. Committing is much harder. It requires that we take a little more time. It requires that we think about other things. We actually think about, why was the law made the way it was? Why is it that people should be driving 55 on the Beltway instead of, what's the latest speed limit? I want to think 75. Sometimes 80. And then you have those curves. You know, somebody throws a curve at you. That's in life as well as on the Beltway. Somebody throws a curve at you, and all of a sudden you have to pay attention to something else. All of a sudden you have that guy in front of you that, I saw it yesterday, he had a blowout. And he ended up, he was on the outside lane, and he ended up on the guardrail on the inside lane. He didn't get hurt. Just going to tell you that. He didn't get hurt. But unexpected. Totally unexpected. Isn't that what life is like? You know, there are rules and regulations that are made for us. I need that. There are rules and regulations that are made for us for the simple reason that life isn't always what we expect it to be. And every once in a while we get a curve thrown at us, or we have a blowout somewhere, or something else happens to us, something we didn't expect to happen. People leave our lives suddenly for no reason. Things disappear. And it gets difficult. Rocks fall in our path. Sometimes that narrow gorge can get quite narrow and confining. What are the hindrances to the narrow gate? The other people in the Beltway. The people in your workplace. What the world wants to hear. That's my favorite one. What the world wants to hear. Because we were talking this morning about Christian music, or at least I was talking about Christian music this morning. The fact that before I go into work at 6:30, and my kids don't get there till 9, 9:15, 9:30, because they are multiply handicapped children. They come in whenever they feel like it. 9, 9:15, 9:30. And I often have Christian music playing because it's calming and it blocks out the noise in the hallway, and I don't have to deal with it while I'm trying to get things ready for my kids when they come in the morning. And sometimes I forget that music is on when the kids start coming in. And I teach in a public school, and so there are confining things that I'm really not allowed to do. Now, I can have that music on anytime I want it, as long as there aren't kids there. But when you stop and think about the fact that regardless of what I believe, I have kids in my class who are Hindu. I have kids in my class who are Muslim. I have kids in my class whose parents are atheists. And there's a reason, whether I like it or not, there's a reason why I'm really not supposed to have Christian music playing in the morning when my kids get there. And if I'm following the rule, the narrow gate, I should be turning it off. And normally I do. Or I put the headphones on if it's if I have my kids doing something specific, I can put the headphones on. I don't have to turn it off right away. But there's a reason. So sometimes we have to follow rules that don't necessarily make sense to us. And in Scripture, sometimes there are these little tiny rules that are made that don't really make sense to us. I'm going to pick on Sabbath this morning because we're all Sabbath keepers. So I'll pick on the Sabbath just to make it clean and easy. Okay? You know, there's a reason that we really should use the Sabbath as a day of rest. Yeah, one of those days, not one of those days when we pile everything else on because it's a day of rest, so we don't have anything else on the calendar. So we pile stuff on. Anybody else do that? Don't raise your hands. Don't raise your hands. We don't want anybody to know. But we do that. And then we have people who are telling us, oh, that's all right. You can do that. Because God has changed his mind. Things are different now. Look at culture. Look at society. Look at what we're supposed to be doing with our lives these days. And follow society. Because it's easier. Less of a headache. Right? Less of a headache. You ever considered that those might be, what is he saying here? A false prophet? False prophet. All right, you know, that's one of these spurious prophet kind of people. A religious imposter, you know, somebody that we don't really have to listen to because they don't make any difference. But you know, in reality, what happens is we let those little things get into our brain. And then we begin to think like they think. So I go back to the Beltway, where the speed limit is a suggestion. Suggestion. You didn't hear that from the pulpit today. All right. John chapter 1. No, I'm sorry. Wrong book. 1 John chapter 4. And I'm in Revelation already. 1 John chapter 4. Beginning in verse 1. Beloved, do not believe every spirit, but test the spirits to see whether they are from God, because many false prophets have gone out into the world. Many false prophets. Now, there are two different words that are used here. The one in Matthew is a pseudo-prophet. But the one in John is pseudo-logos. Logos, a word, a false word. So you have the false prophets who just outright tell you what they want you to believe. And then as 1 John chapter 4 says, you have those who use the words. They're more subtle. They are much more subtle. Because they think you can't argue against them. When Satan comes in and puts his foot into it, that's what's really called the religious imposter. And you know how I like big words sometimes. Promulgating erroneous doctrine. I just like the way that flows. promulgating erroneous doctrine. You know, my mother used to have this, if Moses supposes his roses, then Moses supposes erroneously. I love the word erroneous. It's the only reason I said that. I love the word erroneous. Because we don't think about what that word means. It means false. It means wrong. It means what we are not supposed to be doing. It's erroneous. But the true prophet, I'm not going to read this one, but you can look it up when you want to. It's in Jeremiah chapter 14, verses 14 through 16. Through 16, verses 14 through 16. The true prophet confesses God. The true prophet confesses Jesus Christ. Now, they didn't put Jesus Christ into Jeremiah because Jesus hadn't come yet in person. Now, I'm not going to get into theology where he's already there, but trust me, and if you want to, we can have a Bible study on this. It'd be a great Bible study. But I'm not going there right now because what I want you to understand is that the true prophet confesses God. He confesses Jesus Christ. He confesses that Jesus hung on the cross and came, and that this was prophesied by a true prophet in Isaiah and in Jeremiah. And believe it or not, in Malachi. The false prophet, according to Jeremiah, the false prophet will die by his own desire. And in 2 Peter chapter 2, verse 1, he will secretly introduce ruin and destruction. Secretly. You know what that means? That means he's not being blatant. Like I'm trying to be this morning, I'm not sure I'm making it. You know? The false prophet uses ruin and destruction secretly. And he just kind of weaves it into your life so that maybe you won't realize it. And if a rule changes here and there, you know where I'm going with that one? And the first time I drove on the Beltway, I was 19, and a stupid high school graduate from Valparaiso, Indiana, a small Townsville, where if the speed limit was 30, the speed limit was 30, and the cop would pull you over and he wouldn't give you a ticket. He wouldn't give you a ticket. Do I know what he did? He called my mother. What's worse than getting a speeding ticket? And you want to know what my mother told him? Give that kid a ticket because I'm going to make him go to the justice of the peace. See, we didn't go to the courthouse. We went to the justice of the peace. And you know what? My parents knew the justice of the peace. And we're talking a town of 20,000 people here. It wasn't quite like White Cloud, Michigan, where you have 1,000 people and one old grump. There's 20,000 people, and my parents knew the justice of the peace. So when I walked in, it was rigged. It was rigged. And you know why it was rigged? Because I had to take my whole paycheck from Bob's Northside Drug to pay that stupid speeding ticket. That was the law. And we all don't like the law. Okay? But over time, as you're driving on the Beltway, you know, that's where I was. When I was 19 the first time I drove on the Beltway, and I drove 55 because I was from Valparaiso and I was here visiting. And then I moved here 24 some odd years ago, and I was driving 55, and I thought I was standing still. And now, You know, I have to drive for the first 22 years of that 20 years. I had an easy way. I went out of my house. I got on Rosaryville and Frank Tippett and 301 and Dyson Road, and I was at work. Easy. Now I have to go out and drive down New Hampshire Avenue. Those of you that know this area, you know what New Hampshire Avenue is. Okay? Busy! And then I have to get on 495, and then on these, even if you don't go there, but you live here, you know these names. Edmonston Road and Kenilworth. Come on, people. You know those are the ones where all the accidents happen.
Yep.
All of them. And those are the ones I get to drive on now. And nobody drives 55, ever. But, you know, that's where these false prophets come in. Because they want us to believe that God changes his mind. God changes his mind. And just because he told us that we needed to listen, maybe you don't need to listen so much anymore, because it got easier. And then the rains came. And then the rains came. And you had the blowout. Or somebody, maybe even that crazy person, Larry Watt, changed too many lanes at one time. And you hit him. Or he hit you. Whichever. And you suddenly realize that that speed limit was put there for a purpose. God didn't change, and I'm not saying that God made the speed limit, by the way, so don't take those two and put them together, because then you're misinterpreting what I'm saying. I'm comparing our laws to God's laws. And there are, you know, but the same kind of thing holds true in either one. You're driving down the road of life and you have a blowout. Or you're driving too fast and don't realize that you're coming up on that curve in the road that you know is there, that God knows is there, but you forgot it. Now the most dangerous one are the ones up there at the upper side of the Beltway between Wisconsin Avenue and Colesville Road. Try driving 75, 80 miles an hour on that stretch of the Beltway. If you dare. Trees, sand, rocks, and authority. Who happens to know what happens to the bad tree? Who happens to know what happens with sand? If you build your house on sand. Because he tells us to build it on a rock. And he tells us specifically in his teaching that he sounded like one having authority, not the scribes, not the ones who want to change the law, not the ones who want to talk about traveling a Sabbath day's journey. Rock and authority. Sand cannot support a house in a time of storm. Sand shifts the foundation, not secure, and the house falls. But rock and authority, the solid foundation, we only walk single file through the narrow way. But you know, if you're walking single file until you get to the last man in the line, somebody always has your back. And the one that has the back at the end of the line is Jesus Christ. And we take care of each other. We treat each other the way we want to be treated. We realize that God is the rule. me and turn to number 505. 505. Love lifted me. Number 505 is our closing hymn.
Please stand for the benediction. Therefore, he is able also to save forever those who draw near to God through him, since he always lives to make intercession for them. For it was fitting for us to have such a high priest, holy, innocent, undefiled, separated from sinners, and exalted above the heavens.